Welcome to the Regenerate Brands podcast. This is a place for consumers, operators, and investors to learn about the consumer brands supporting regenerative agriculture and how they're changing the world. This is your host, Kyle, joined by my co-host, AC, who's going to take us into the episode.
On this episode, we have, drumroll please, just Kyle and I. We have just Kyle and myself to talk about two very important things to kick off this new year, y'all. Number one, what have we learned in our first 15 episodes? There's millions of takeaways, but we really tried to boil it down into our top 4 to share with y'all, and we're really excited to do that and dive into that on the episode. Number two, what we've got cooking for you in 2023. It's a new year. We got new goals. We got new plans. We have new stuff to share. We have some awesome new additions to our game plan. We're excited to share those with you all, and we walk through them live on the episode. So let's get this new year kicked off. Here we go. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Regen Brands podcast. We are live for episode 16. You're just getting Kyle and I today. So Kyle, how you feeling today, buddy?
Feel great, man. Sweet 16. You know, we took a little hiatus post-holidays. It's nice to be back on the pod. Looking forward to chatting through some of, last year's highlights. But, yeah, feeling really good.
Yeah, if we're going to talk about natural systems, we got to respect the laws of nature and the fact that in Q4, we should be resting. We should be eating a little more. We should be hibernating. So we took that personally for the podcast.
Of course, with the cover crop, we don't want that land to fallow. So, we're not doing this wrong.
Exactly. Well, y'all, we're really excited to bring everybody more episodes, more content, all kinds of fun stuff in 2023. We have a really cool game plan for all of y'all, but we first want to start off with just thanking everybody for their support. I mean, anybody that listens, that watches on YouTube, that subscribes, that reviews, that rates the podcast, that shares it with a friend, that all is really the most important thing to this thing having any sort of success. So we appreciate that. If you haven't done any of that, we would really appreciate it if you subscribed on your favorite podcast platform. If you gave us a review, if you gave us a 5-star rating, we would really appreciate that. But we want to thank everybody for their support in 2022.
Totally agree. It's been so cool to see the type of engagement we've had. I think a couple of people have posted organically on LinkedIn, like, hey, I just got a job at XYZ company and I got to listen to an episode on Regen Brands to learn more about the founder story. And to know that the podcast is being utilized in that capacity to get people more connected with these brands and to hear their stories is just super, super cool. So yeah, we really appreciate the support, everyone.
Yeah, I mean, shout out to my guy, John, new employee, new team member at Simply. That's who Kyle's talking about. Found Simply on the Regen Brands podcast and then ended up getting a job with them last year. And that's why we do this. And I would say, one of our biggest takeaways from last year was our hypothesis that these brands needed more support. They needed to be spotlighted more and that we could build a community around supporting them. We were very bullish on that as a hypothesis and it rang true. And there's been a great, coalition of folks that have rallied around, this podcast, but more importantly, the brands that have been featured on it to learn about them and support them. And that's the whole goal at the end of the day.
Totally agree.
So we're going to dive into really two things. This is going to be a quick podcast for everybody. We're going to talk about what we learned in these first 15 episodes. And we're going to talk about the fun stuff that's coming up in 2023. So excited to dive into both topics. We tried to pick out some key things that were takeaways from all 15 of the first episodes, which is crazy to think we're already 15 episodes in. So that's super awesome. And then we're going to talk about some things that are kind of upcoming in the new year, right? So what have we learned in the first 15 episodes? There's definitely a lot to pick out from there. Kyle and I kind of picked out the 3 to 5 biggest topics that we saw. But buddy, I'm excited to share those. Give me your thoughts on kind of sharing those takeaways.
Yeah, before we even dive into the specifics, let's just give a shout out to all the brands we've had. So we've had Christy Lewis at Quinn, and we've had Jamie Ager from Hickory Nut Gap. We've had Heather Terry from Good Sam, Megan and Keith from White Leaf Provisions, Alec from Alec Ice Cream, Paul from Pasture Bird, Daniela from Big Picture Foods, David from Dr. Bronner's, Carol and Ken from Lotus, Tim from Philosopher Foods, Stephanie and Blake from Alexander, Justin from Kettle and Fire, Joni from Snacktivist. This is an incredibly long list. I did not expect it to take this long to do this. It feels like it's a really long time. But we've also had Cirilla and Matt from Simply, and then Phil Graves from Wild Ideas. So just shout out to all those awesome people and incredible brands for taking the time to do an episode with us. like Anthony said, we want to make sure that we kind of recap and highlight some of the most common themes and important things that we've learned as hosts doing this podcast, because we're learning just as much as the audience in many cases here.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I'll go ahead and kick us off with the first takeaway. And I'm the angel investor of the two of us that's invested in a handful of these brands and continues to look at a lot of deals in this space. And what was one of the clearest takeaways of every single episode? These brands need a different type of finance partner, no matter what stage they're at. But we talked to a bunch that were kind of at that earlier stage. There's not enough funding period out there in the ecosystem for them. And then when you look at how they're funded versus typical CPG, it's going to be a little different. And so they need different partners. They need incredible high amounts of mission alignment, even greater than, your typical natural or organic CPG company. And that was one of the biggest takeaways that we had from all 15 episodes for sure.
Totally. And I want to riff on that a little bit. Anthony, like you mentioned, you've got the investment chops between the two of us. I just know how to sell stuff. I can't invest to save my life. I
think you're selling yourself short a little bit there, bro.
Maybe a little bit. I don't know. Humility, key. Yeah. Talk about how the current economic situation is going to change the way brands have to fund next year, because you just mentioned that in 2022 it was hard. And in 2023, it's going to get harder. So just tell us a little bit about what you're seeing and how you think that maybe some region brands could, navigate these more challenging waters in the upcoming year.
Yeah, for sure. So we're seeing a huge shift from kind of growth at all costs to really focusing on profitable growth and really healthy unit economics. That's across, all kind of fundraising right now, not just CPG, but definitely in CPG. And, there's an article that New Hope put out, I think yesterday. It was all about basically how, funding is really just drying up across the space, which is accurate. And when people can leave their money in the bank and make 4% risk-free in the bank with the interest rates the way that they are right now, it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge for brands to raise money from, angel investors like myself that are really early stage. And it's going to be a challenge to raise, from those institutional investors, the venture capital firms, the private equity firms. They're sitting on a lot of cash, but they're going to scrutinize the investments way more. And I think the valuations are going to be a lot less, founder friendly. Valuations have kind of gotten away from those fundamentals and gotten inflated a little bit, which, everything's cyclical, right? It's only natural that we've kind of had this jump and then we'll kind of have this reset. I unfortunately think we'll lose some really great brands to this downturn. I hate to say that, but that's kind of what the math just tells us. But I think with new creative ways like crowdfunding, with continuing to lean on kind of angel investors and building your networks there, with all kinds of cool new distribution trial mechanisms to increase revenues and increase profitability, people have a fighting chance. But that's really what it's all going to be about. It's going to be about really digging into the hardcore unit economics and the fundamentals and profitable growth, not just grabbing a bunch of new doors, grabbing a bunch of new distribution, not making any money on it. It's going to be about paced, profitable growth.
I couldn't agree more. And I think what's going to be really interesting in 2023 is the intersection of everything you just talked about, how brands are going to be focusing more on profitability. But at the same time, retailers are asking brands for more than they ever have before because they're trying to combat inflation. And instead of changing their margins, they want brands to fund that. So they're asking for more promotions, deeper promotions, EDLP spends. So this is really interesting, combination of brands want to be more profitable, retailers are asking for more spend, and it's going to create a tension point within the industry this year. And it's going to be really interesting to see how it shakes out. And I think that the smaller brands in particular have less leverage, so it's going to be more difficult for them to deal with that environment. But as long as we can have these sort of open, honest, candid conversations and we can talk about, hey, we're not trying to burn money here to buy distribution like you mentioned. We're looking to maintain some level of profitability and sustainability for not just the land, but our business. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all shakes out.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. And, to just make that really simple math for folks that aren't intimately familiar with the space, it's basically, let's say you have a manufacturer, you have the brand that's selling the product, you have a distributor, and you have a retailer. And if the price on the shelf is staying the same, or maybe it's only increasing a little bit, right? Let's say 10%, but cost of goods across that whole supply chain have gone up 20%. Somebody's got to eat that, that 10% difference in their margin. And what Kyle's saying is the retailer is really pushing on the upstream supply chain to eat that. and the upstream supply chain is pushing on the retailer to eat that. And so there's going to be this tug of war of where is that going to go in the supply chain. And I hope that, you know, the other key stakeholders can support these brands in not having to harbor all that margin compression on their businesses, because especially if they're sub 5 billion, sub 10 million, you know, they need to build healthy margins so that they can continue to get funded, they can continue to grow, and they can continue to have those good fundamentals that you just mentioned.
Totally. Yeah, and it becomes all the more important for brands who are actually looking to do good for the land, right? You know, where they're not looking to turn and burn and sell and selling commodity everything. So yeah, it's going to be interesting, and we didn't plan to talk about this, so this is just a great organic conversation.
It's a good segue into the next one too. It's a really
exactly. Let's jump into, you know, one of the other things that we learned, one of the recurring themes that we caught, you know, going through the first 15 episodes, and that's we need to build more coalitions and increase the capacity through collective action, and basically like the capacity to support regen is what we're trying to build here, and. I think that through partnership and through unification, we can make a lot more impact than we can as individuals. And that needs to be seen throughout the entire movement. You know, right now, ironically, there is sort of a contentious space within certification and not certification within regen. And we've talked about this with a lot of our brands. And this is not to say that any certification is bad or good or better, but they're vying for the number one position instead of looking at, you know, biodiversity within the regenerative segment of Regen CPG and saying these should all exist together and they all do different things, and that's good.
So hold on, Kyle. Hold on. I want you to really drive that point home. So what you're saying is right now we have certifications competing to have a monocrop mindset of certifications instead of a biodiverse mindset of multiple certifications that all can represent different nuances and different, you know, maybe products or production practices in the space.
Exactly. I mean, you couldn't have said it better. It's like to have a single regenerative certification feels so backwards to what everything regenerative is about. It's about biodiversity, and every different certification can serve a different need, and that's okay. And then what I think there's an opportunity for is the unification in some form where all these different certifications can live, and we can have a unified message to retailers and to consumers so that they can understand, okay, like regen or regenerative agriculture means this. All these different certifications fall under that umbrella, because right now the consumers are super confused. Okay, like what's the difference between organic and regenerative organic and savory EOV and Regenified and all these new certifications that are popping up? And it's convoluting the message. Retailers are confused. They're not sure which ones to support. And that is inhibiting the ability for consumers to really adopt at retail. And that's where they learn. So it's this interesting cycle that we're in right now.
Yeah. And we want to be really clear that we love what the certification bodies are doing. We appreciate their work. And we know that they're not sitting at the strategic planning meeting at the whiteboard saying, how can we put down the other certifications, or how can we outcompete the certification? What they're trying to do is boost their certification and support their growers and their brands to the best of their ability. So we're not saying that any of the activity is malicious, right? And we also know these people have spent time and money, and you know they are very convicted in their methodologies, and that being truly regenerative. But I think we're going to have to see some coalescing of multiple bodies for this thing to really go further. And you know, it makes me kind of think back to when I got really passionate about regenerative agriculture. I saw something that made so much sense that I had to take a good amount of time to learn. But I was so passionate about it because I almost felt like the whole thing just needed better marketing. You know, it needed better messaging, and it just needed a louder voice or voices. And we have to continue to fight that fight. You know, we're not gonna win that battle overnight, but we have to do that at every level of the supply chain, like you just talked about. We have to do that with the retailers and the distributors, and then we have to do that with the consumers. And I almost think that that's different a little bit. There's definitely some overlap there. But let's stick with more that commercial side before we go to the consumer side, right? So like what kind of coalition building or coalescing or increasing capacity is available for regen brands? And like what other folks can we look to in the space that have done similar things that we could learn from, or maybe kind of copycat and take some of those tactics? What do you see there?
I mean, I certainly think that I think the Non-GMO Project in particular has done a fantastic job of building retailer relationships. And I mean, you see those tags up and that insignia up on almost every package, in every retail store these days. So I think that there's a lot we can take from that playbook and say, okay, this is how we would approach. But the step that needs to happen before that is, okay, like what is the unifying message? And how do we get all these different vested interested parties to unify around that, to feel like, okay, yeah, I want to be part of this, even though I might feel a little bit different here, like regenerative has to be organic, which I think is a great thing. I certainly want to reduce glyphosate spray. Like I'm all about that. And I think you made a really good point of saying like, nobody's being malicious here. Everybody's trying to do the right thing in their own way. Right. But yeah, I really think the unification step has to happen first, because without that, the playbook almost doesn't matter, because everybody's going to be on different pages.
So let's wave our magic wand and say that's happened, right? We've unified a framework and a scorecard around the certification bodies have coalesced, or a large majority of the regen brands have coalesced around this is what regenerative agriculture is. We might have different monikers on pack, but this is what it is. Like I've been trying to think through what's the most important thing to do first. Is it to have a trade association that does a bunch of PR and works with the retailers to educate them and just increases like trial and distribution for brands? Is it for somebody to start like a sales brokerage that just hustles regen brands into these retailers and gets really immediate results in distribution and velocities? Is it, I don't know what it is, right? Is it creating an influencer platform on social media that drives a bunch of direct to consumer business for these brands that doesn't involve traditional brick and mortar retail? You and I just had dinner last night and we were kind of riffing on these things, but you've been in the space in an operating capacity much longer than I have. So like, what do you see as maybe the most important of those opportunities to kind of start with? If we get that definition, or we get that agreement on the frameworking, what's the first action we take?
Right. And I love the way we think about this. Like we mentioned yesterday, we have complementary skill sets. We're experts in very different areas, right? So for me, I immediately think retail. And I think that if we can get the top 5 retail chains in the natural channel to adopt whatever the unifying message is, so that's like Whole Foods, Sprouts, Natural Grocers, Infra, NCG, we get those 5 bodies to say, okay, we're willing to support this. We're going to put up the signage in store and then thrive from like an e-com perspective. We get those 6 retailers on board. I think the rest of the channel will follow suit, and eventually MULO will adopt, just like they have. And when I say MULO, that's like conventional retailers will adopt the same system. And it can just be a unification process across the board. I think that's what needs to happen first, because as great as a PR strategy might be, and I don't mean to say that like retail is king and nothing else matters. Yeah, people learn when they shop while they're there, while they're looking at the tags. And I think that we should certainly follow that up with a marketing campaign and some other, educational materials in some capacity, but it needs to happen where people make their purchases.
And just to put it out there in the universe, as soon as someone wants to pay someone to do that, I will happily sign up for that job. I mean, I think Kyle and I do a lot of that in our spare time for free as much as we can. I mean, more so than you than me, bro. And I really just, salute you for that. You've done some really incredible stuff for the space. But somebody's got to step up, right? Somebody's got to step up and lead that has, some sort of an unbiased viewpoint and isn't super partisan to certain pieces of the ecosystem. And then somebody's got to fund it, because you got to staff it. You got to have those conversations. You got to build those resources. You have to coalesce all these different people. Like, let's just say, we're going to put out a resource this year that publishes every single brand that we've seen in America that's made some sort of regenerative claim. I'm working on it right now. And I think when I looked at the sheet last night, it was right around 100 brands. So just think about the funding and the time needed to coalesce just that group, let alone go take that information to the broader ecosystem like we're talking about, of retailers, of distributors, of consumers, et cetera.
It's a really great point. And I want to kind of segue this into a current event and the reason, like the why we're doing this, why we care so much about this. And think about the impact we could make. And let's use the California storms that just happened, right? 150-year storm, absolutely insane amount of water. So much so that the state doesn't know what to do with it. They can't fill the reservoirs enough because that's going to cause potential flood harm. Like, there are so many issues going on. And I'm reading a book that Tim recommended on his podcast episode. And it talks about how for every 1% of soil organic matter that we increase in soil, the water retention rate increases by 20,000 gallons per acre. California is the world's 5th largest economy and is tons and tons and tons of agricultural land.
Yeah.
If we could build 1% of soil organic matter, which is entirely feasible with regenerative practices, probably
Mm-hmm.
I would guess, and I am not a farmer, I'm not an expert, I would guess within 1 to 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
Think about the ability to absorb that water to reduce the amount of flooding, mudslides, like financial impact. And it also stores more water, so we rely less on irrigation systems in the future. It can just have such a humongous impact. And this
Mm-hmm.
is why unification is so important. If we can get more people on board to understand what this is, how to support it, like we can make a humongous difference for the future of this world.
Mm-hmm. And I couldn't agree more. And we could come up with thousands of those examples, maybe even just from the first 15 episodes, but for sure from all the brands that we know doing great work in the space. And I'm going to throw a takeaway in that we didn't prep for, which is when the brands really have the opportunity and the stage to show how vastly different their production practices and their growing practices and their manufacturing practices are than their conventional counterparts. I mean, it is insane. Like the three episodes that come to mind when I think about that are Daniela with Big Picture and the Olives, Tim with the Almonds at Philosopher, and Phil at Wild Idea Buffalo. I mean, when you really sit there and you listen to those three people talk about how vastly different and all the brands, not to just single them out, but all the brands, when you really listen to them come on the show or anywhere talk about how vastly different all that stuff is for them versus their counterparts, it's like, how do we not do this 100% of the time? How do we not give these people all of our market share of baby food or bison meat or olives or almonds or
Rice.
baking mixes, right? Rice, whatever. Like that to me was one of the biggest takeaways that we didn't even think about before the show is, we have to increase the capacity and make more awesome content and tell more great stories about how vastly different these supply chains are than their conventional counterparts.
It's such a great point. And I distinctly remember listening to Ken and Carol talk about, I think it was how many people are involved in the creation of rice. It's like the number one employment in the world. And I think we both had like a massive wow.
Yeah.
It's just mind blowing. And there's
Mm-hmm.
more agricultural, more arable land used for rice than anything else on the planet. And it's like, if we can get that to shift and use less water on that specific crop alone, like we can make an enormous impact. So I think you're spot on, man. Like giving these brands and people and individuals the opportunity to tell their stories and why, and share their why it's different, why they care about it, what they're trying to accomplish, it can really move the needle.
Yeah. And it's how we connect with other human beings through story, right? And when we talk about the fact that we need a certain level of commercial success to make this thing happen, we have to connect with consumers. We have to drive trial and purchase and repurchase at grocery stores, online, through whatever sort of channel we're talking about. And there's a ton of opportunities there. But I think one of the other takeaways that we noted was we have to coalesce around a really much more buttoned up, easy to understand marketing and messaging about what regenerative agriculture is, why does it matter, and why you should buy these products, or even why you should pay a premium for some of them. So riff on that. What were our thoughts on that?
Yeah, from like for the average consumer who doesn't work in this space, right? Retailers historically have relied on third-party certifications to create their messaging for them and to help educate consumers. And right now, because we're in this vying for number one position spot, there is not a single unified message. So retailers are having a difficult time messaging to consumers what regen is. So we need to build that cohesive message so that we can start with that retailer adoption and get consumers on board. Because right now it's really confusing. Like, does regenerative have to be organic or does it not? Does regenerative mean that something just has cover crops or does it not? Do consumers even need to know that much? I would guess that 75 to 90% don't even need to know that. What they really need to know is that supporting brands that are incorporating regenerative ingredients into their product offerings improves the planet and also has some other social benefits for the workers. And I don't want to like dilute it to just one singular thing. That's just the one that's the most important to me. That's not to diminish the level of anything else. But that's why we need to do this. And to Anthony's point, like driving trial and repurchase, like supporting these brands is the most important thing I think that we can do right now. from
Hmm.
a purchase perspective, you can buy an electric truck. I think we talked about this in another podcast. Electric truck, electric car. That's a $50,000 plus $100,000 purchase that you do maybe once, twice in your life.
Hmm.
But we all go to the store and buy groceries on a weekly basis. And if you
Hmm.
can trade up, pay 20, 15, 20% more to support a form of agriculture that is benefiting both like the nutritional density for yourself as a consumer and to benefit the planet, like that's what
Hmm.
we need to be trying to do.
100%. And I think about data and research, and we need a massive amount of funding to fund a massive amount of research and data and education, right? So we need to do research and gather data that tells us what the baseline is. Then we need to invest in education to continue to survey, gather more data, and improve basically the efficacy of that work. So shout out to avid listener Lindsay Boyle up in Canada. I know she wants to do some of this work. She's working on doing some of this work, kind of this consumer research piece, right? How do we get multiple brands, or how do we get one of the certifications or all the certifications to invest in real consumer research that helps us understand when they look at this moniker on pack, what does that actually mean to them? Because it's going to be a 3-second instantaneous 1 to 3 bullet point thing. It's not going to be all 100 bullet points that got the person the certification, right? So what do they think about when they see the word regenerative on pack? Do they like it abbreviated? Do they like it in full length? I mean, there's a million questions that we could come up with, but what we really need to do systematically is someone has to come forward and pay for real research to set the baseline. And I know some people are working on this and doing this. Then we have to take that data and we have to say, okay, here's how we're going to increase the efficacy of that, or change the narrative, make it more simple, whatever we need to do that we learn from that, and then keep iterating on that process over and over and over again. And if you look at like the USDA organic seal, we know what that is. They're doing those surveys every year, like in a decent quantity, but we're not doing that for regenerative agriculture by itself, the individual certifications by itself, individual products, because cookies are going to be different than beef and milk's going to be different than, eggs, right? So what does that mean to people in those specific categories as well is super important. And that just takes a lot of money, a lot of effort, and a lot of time. And, I don't want to paint it as some daunting thing, because we're closer than I guess, it appears, but it is work that needs to be done that's going to propel all of this forward. And we have to figure out a way to do it together. Because right now, what I see is a lot of people, running really fast and really hard and working their butts off. But how do we do that together?
I think that's a really good point. And what I immediately think of is like the power of that data and what it can be used for. And I think about a really poor example of the power of data with the recent Harvard study about, the healthiest food score, and how a box of
Yeah.
Lucky Charms is somehow healthier than beef or an egg. And it's like, that's the power of this type of research. Right.
Yeah.
And what's scary is like most people might see that and laugh about it and say, hey, like,
Hmm.
I'm not going to believe this. But that
Hmm.
study is what's creating food policies in school districts and
Hmm.
hospitals. And so if we can actually create that data, like you mentioned, I think that it has a ton of power that we can use.
Hmm.
And I think it's a great idea. Something we haven't discussed before. And I would love to see that happen.
Yeah, and I mean, when I think about my life, I've always worked really hard and given great effort to everything I've done, but the great successes that I've seen were about the fact that that effort was exerted on really important leverage points of high leverage, right? Which is why I love to see Kiss the Ground really focusing on policy now, because that's probably the most important leverage point to get regenerative agriculture adoption in this country is policy, right? So when we look at CPG, what is that? I think one of those leverage points is this whole messaging to consumers piece. It's going to be one of the highest leverage pieces that if we can really figure out how to do that in a simple but compelling way, we will solve a lot of problems on the trial and the repurchase side.
100% agree.
What's our last takeaway, bro? I'm spacing on it. I'm about to pull up my list.
I mean, those
here.
are the three, man. Those are the three bullet points we
Okay.
had prepped. We threw another one in there.
Okay.
One of the other things that's popping up in my head is like, maybe we talk about like the barriers, like why it's so hard to do this. And when you mentioned policy, this is what kind of sparked it for me. And right now, and again, I'm not a farmer. I'm only reiterating the things that I've heard and said, speaking to farmers and those who are way smarter than me and far more entrenched in this space. But based on my current understanding of how a lot of the agricultural systems work in the United States, in order to qualify for farm insurance, or crop insurance rather, which is a government funded entity and government run entity, you often have to spray chemicals on your land. And if you're trying to adopt regenerative principles, you're trying to reduce the amount of chemicals you're spraying on your land and implement all these other different systems that are beneficial for the environment. So a huge barrier to entry, and this is where policy comes into play, is that it's a massive risk to any farmer who's trying to move away from the monocrop industrialized agricultural space, because according to the government, if you're not doing that, they will not insure you. So it's just a massive amount of risk. And this comes back into play with the partnerships that we talked about earlier. We need a different type of funding method so that farmers can still be protected and take some of these risks to try to adopt these new principles and practices. So this is something that came up. We've already hit our 3 bullet points. I'm just spitballing at this stage.
Yeah, we're so good we even threw in a fourth. And I think we should acknowledge, like, look, we set out with the mission of this podcast to be focused on CPG. That was very intentional. We understand that regenerative agriculture is way bigger than that, and increasing the adoption of regenerative agriculture. There's a ton of things we could talk about. I mean, somebody might listen to this podcast and be like, you guys haven't talked about farmers enough, like, at all. And like, that's super important. It's like, yes, but we're trying to be focused on how do we improve CPG businesses with regenerative supply chains. So that's a huge piece of it, but we can only tackle so much. And we know there's geopolitical, there's, rural economy dynamics, there's all these things that we could mention, right? But those are our main takeaways for the people that we've talked to about their businesses, which are CPG brands in mainstream retail distribution. That's our focus.
And for another reason, if you want to hear me talk about farming, you're going to hate it because I have no idea what I'm talking about. Or geopolitics, like you're going to exactly like. There's no reason for me to try to be dangerous in that world because I'm not. I'm not going to pretend to be. And I think we're both on the same page there. But Anthony, I want to touch on a couple other things. So, you mentioned some of the work that I'm doing, and I really appreciate that call out. Anthony has done, I would say, 90% of the work behind the scenes to get this podcast going. So I want to give him a huge shout out for all of his energy, efforts, and the thought and the intention that he has put into this thing. And come 2023, like there's a lot more coming that Anthony's primarily focused on building out. So I want to give you an opportunity to talk about like what's new in 2023 for those who want to engage in this type of content. Yeah,
I really appreciate that, bro. Thank you. You're gonna make me cry on camera. You got to be crying in the club. So big
bro, I mean it, man. Like I mean it. I just want to reiterate, like you have really pushed this thing forward, dude. And it's like it's just fun to be a part of it with you, man. No joke.
Well, I appreciate that, and having you as a co-pilot's been awesome as well, brother. So it's been fun, and we're gonna keep our foot on the gas pedal. 2023 plans. What is to come? So first and foremost, like I said, what's our focus? Our focus is on spotlighting CPG brands seeking mainstream distribution for products with regenerative supply chains. That's it. Period. End of story. So that's what our interviews are going to be focused on. I mean, like I said, we have 100 brands. We got to get through all those brands. We got to get all those people on the podcast. So we have quite a ways to go, but we're going to continue to spotlight those people because what I can tell you is, having focused in the regenerative agriculture space for 2+ years now, I saw a real dearth of attention and funding and really support for those people, which is kind of counterintuitive because you think CPG is like the sexy thing. But, even in my role at RFSI, really focused on the finance side of things, there's land funds set up to support farmers. There's all kinds of debt providers now supporting farmer transition to regenerative. There's people doing debt for infrastructure building, for processing, right? There's no dedicated entity that's put their flag in the ground and said, we invest in regenerative CPG. Like there is for others, right? We got VC ag tech covered. We got private equity land funds covered. We got infrastructure covered. We got debt providers for farmers covered. And they're still not nearly enough. It's still really, really small that we need to increase massively. But we have lagged in our support for these folks. And so I just want to be really clear, like that is the focus of this podcast. That was what we will continue to do. And we are excited to do that and support those folks because we just think they're doing really important work. And, why we feel like it's so important to support them is if we cannot create markets for these products, we are screwed. And a lot of times what I see get lost in conversations that we have about regenerative is we are still growing food and selling food. So the ultimate guide to changing production practices is going to a producer and saying, can you do something differently? I will pay you a premium for it, or I will pay you the same you're making. It's a business, right? And so we have to have more commercial conversations about building markets because we can't change anything about production if there's no way to sell it into a market.
I think it's a really great point, and I like the way you laid that out. And it makes me think like we're essentially what we're trying to do is take the bottleneck and move it one step forward. So the resources are starting to come for the producers on the ground, the farmers who are making these changes. And the next step is, like to Anthony's point, we need to develop the market so that people can buy and continue to buy the products that are being manufactured and produced in the correct way. So I just really like how I laid that out. And then we'll have to push the bottleneck forward one more step, eventually. But yeah, I completely agree. Obviously, we're doing this podcast together, but I think it's the right next step.
So how are we going to do all that, right? It's really nice to say that's the mission, that's the vision, that's the focus, but what are we actually going to do? One, way more podcast interviews like what we've done in the first 15 episodes. That's number one. That's coming your way. Two, we understand people could not all spend an hour listening to a full podcast. We appreciate everyone that does. We hope that everyone does, but we know people sometimes need a little SparkNotes version of that. So we are going to be investing in producing a blog for every single episode. That's a 5-minute or less read that covers all the key points of what we talk about in the episodes. And on top of that, Kyle and I aren't going to write it because we can find someone better, i.e. named Christina Tober, who's going to help us write all those blogs. Christina's awesome. Really looking forward to working with her on this project, but it's going to give us another piece of shareable content that the brands can leverage that we can use to tell their story. And it's going to be a way to pull more people into learning about these brands if they don't have a full hour to listen to the podcast episode.
I think it's going to do wonders for what we've done. Like I mentioned, Anthony's done the bulk of the marketing work in particular. Last night, he's twisting my arm. He's like, Kyle, can you just post once a week on LinkedIn? And it's something I just don't really enjoy doing, but I'm going to do because I don't like self-promotion. This is not my jam. And I'm not saying that Anthony does. It's just not what I like to do.
I do. We could say it's one of my great strengths.
I just didn't want to put words in your mouth, but if you say it, that's all good. But for me, it's about the mission. It's about building the audience, getting more people to buy these products so we can convert more acreage, so that we can protect this planet and improve the nutritional density of the food that people are consuming. So mission alignment, 100% there. But I think the rest of these things. The rest of the newsletter, the recaps, the blog, like it's going to push us. It's going to take us to the next level. And all Anthony's idea, Anthony's going to execute it flawlessly. And I'm super pumped to see how this audience grows and to do my very, very, very meager job of one post a week, which I will have to do.
Hey, so now all the listeners, we got to hold Kyle accountable for at least one LinkedIn post a week. He's got some social accountability in there.
Exactly. That's why I brought it up. I need that.
So you mentioned the last point we want to cover of what's to come this year. We will be launching an email newsletter. It will coincide with this episode debuting. So as soon as this episode is out, people will have this email newsletter in their inboxes. So little predicting of the future there, and some social accountability for me to get that done. That work is very much in progress, and that will be happening when this episode drops. We will obviously feature our episodes. We will feature the blog post, which we're going to call the Regen Recaps. And then we will also post all kinds of cool stuff that's going on in Regen CPG, news, insights, jobs. So all of our founders and executives out there that listen to the podcast, if you have cool stuff that you want included in that newsletter, please send it my way. Please send it our way. We'll be kind of tracking the space and pulling that together ourselves. And we're going to let that be dynamic. I'm not going to be dogmatic about what we include. We will continue to publish, and we'll just continue to iterate based on what we think the audience really wants to see. And we got some other big plans that I'm going to keep secret for now, but those are the main things. Awesome episodes coming with more brands, the Regen Recaps to recap those episodes, and then we're going to get this email newsletter launched, and we're going to be rocking and rolling in 2023. Oh
yeah, it's smart that Anthony's keeping it secret, even from me, because if he tells me, I'll probably just blurt it out in like the wrong order. So it's a good move, and I'm excited to see what it is. Like, I love surprises. This will be great. Cool. This was super fun. Like, this is the first time we've done an episode like this. Obviously, we did episode 1 kind of talking about our backstories, but this was just sort of riffing on what we've learned, kind of, I think, honing in our own message. Like, what is it that we're trying to do for 2023 and beyond? And it's been great. Longer than I expected in a good way.
And we got to wrap the way that we started it with, look, we felt very bullish about doing this. We thought it would be fun. We wanted to support these folks, but we had no idea what we were doing. We had no idea what would happen. And, every listen, every share, every review, every 5-star rating, every nice email, every comment on LinkedIn, I mean, like, it really does mean the world to us. And like, as of right now, we don't get paid to do this. And so, that's the fuel to our fire. And we just really appreciate it. And we hope that it's making an impact. We think it's making an impact. And, I personally just can't thank everybody enough for all that support through these first 15 episodes.
I'm not going to try to say better than that. So I just totally agree and emphasize and reiterate everything Anthony just said. It really does mean the world. I love when I get like a text or somebody's like, oh yeah, I just listened to this episode. It's so cool that people want to listen and learn about this stuff and how they can improve their own health and the health of the planet. And that's at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do.
Absolutely, man. We got dogs barking in the house. That means it's time to wrap the recording. But dude, really appreciate you, bro. Really appreciate everybody out there that's listening, and lots of fun stuff to come in 2023. So here we go. For show notes, episode transcripts, and more information on our guests and what we discuss on the show, check out our website, regen-brands.com. That is regen-brands.com. You can also find our Regen recaps on the website. Regen recaps take less than 5 minutes to read and cover all the key points of the full hour-long conversations. You can check out our YouTube channel, Regen Brands Podcast, for all of our episodes with both video and audio. The best way to support our work is to give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, subscribe to future episodes, and share the show with your friends. Thanks for tuning in to the Regen Brands Podcast, brought to you by the Regen Coalition and Outlaw Ventures. We hope you learned something new in this episode, and it empowers you to use your voice, your time, and your dollars to help us build a better and more regenerative food system. Love you guys.